Welcome to Solutions OP Clinical Trials Podcast. My name is Olga and I'm the Managing Director of Solutions OP. We are a small team of experienced professionals working on clinical trials in the United Kingdom. I'll use our podcast to discuss hot topics in clinical trials and provide analysis of the latest trends and challenges in pharma and medical device industries, not just in the UK but globally. Thank you for listening. Welcome to today's episode of the podcast. In this episode, I will be talking about the recent symposium which I attended. It was the fifth symposium between FDA, MHRA and Health Canada, where the regulators from these three countries, they had a presentation on their views on good clinical practice, risk management, and everything, pharmacokinetics and so on. It was a very interesting 3-day event with plenty of discussions, and I will try to cover each day in the upcoming podcasts. So today I'll be talking about the first day of the symposium, when they discussed the good clinical practice guidelines, the latest changes, and the risk management. So the latest GCP guideline, as those of you who work in the industry know, they allow you more freedom to adapt the clinical trial according to the risk. So that's particularly the changes particularly affecting the sponsors and the investigators involved in the clinical research. So if you have worked in the past guideline, you know that GCP was not that flexible, and we had a lot of issues, particularly during COVID-19, when we had to adapt and work in a different way. All of a sudden, we had all these challenges by GCP saying things that should be done in a specific way. I even remember I had that very funny conversation with a colleague of mine during COVID. He was saying, well, are we allowed to do that? I wish there was some regulatory guideline. And I said, well, use the round thing attached to your shoulders. So we had a good laugh about it. But the reality is, it was not open to interpretations. So we had to follow quite rigid guidelines. So I know many people will say, yeah, but you still had that opportunity for risk assessment even in the previous version. Yes, we did. But it wasn't as flexible as it is in the latest version that we have of the guideline. So on that first day, the main discussions were about risk-based approach in clinical trials and also risk management. And part of the hot topics were the decentralized clinical trials and real-world evidence. So those of you who don't know what is a decentralized clinical trial, so it's basically when you're trying to conduct the clinical trial close to the patient's home. You have nurses visiting patients at home, or you ship the drug to the patient so they can administer it at home and so on. So you're trying to make it more flexible, monitor patient remotely and so on to give opportunity to more people to participate, and partially to not just to make it more convenient, but really to be able to collect more data, bigger pool of data, and include more patients from different backgrounds. And the real-world data, as you probably know, is the data which is collected as a part of the routine care. And sometimes we use such data in clinical trials as well to assess medical devices or drugs which are already approved on the market, and we have some data collected there already. So, as I said, the risk-based approach is not something new, but the new GCP provides us more flexibility. So I'll start first with the risk-based approach in clinical trials, and I'll try to do my analysis, not just tell you the main topics of the day, but really tell you what I think about them and the challenges that we can have with the new approaches. So what are the benefits of the risk-based approach to clinical trials? So obviously it provides you flexibility. You can decide what is important for the safety and efficacy of the drug and focus on this particular part rather than doing 100% of everything. It also allows you to plan and think about the impact that the clinical trial will have on the patient's life and try to adjust it in a way that it's feasible for people to participate, not make it too complex, give them opportunities, some things to be done at home and so on. So it gives that opportunity for those companies and drugs where that might work. It gives them option to do it in a different way rather than the traditional standard clinical trials. Another important part is that GCP provides harmonized international strategy to high quality clinical research, and that could be followed by countries around the world. So obviously I'm going to touch on the challenges in a moment, and you'll see the some of the challenges with these approaches. So what are the challenges? The first one is, now critical thinking is difficult when the industry is heavily regulated and it relies on guidance from the regulators. So we all hear that, you do your risk assessment and so on and do things differently. But we see guidance coming from the regulators, literally hundreds. If you think about all the guidelines published by all big regulators within 1 year, you'll see there's quite a lot of information. And some guidelines are very detailed, and they expect you to do things in a very specific way. So to tell people to have critical thinking and at the same time to not really allow them that flexibility when it comes to regulations and guidelines, then it's challenging. And that's a challenge that I think it's not just for the industry but for regulators as well. We need to find a way of working around this. So the other big problem is the fear of doing something that will not be accepted of by the regulators, and that's a completely reasonable fear because many companies want to have some kind of assurance that if they do something differently, they won't have an inspection by the regulator and be told that actually that's not acceptable. We don't accept your risk management plan, and at the moment there is no guarantee that this will not happen, and people don't know if that happens, what do you do next? So I would understand if the industry is still very reluctant to make any significant changes out of fear how this will be accepted by the regulators, because we know that they say yes, you can do things differently, but we don't know if that's going to be okay at the end of the day. So the other very big problem is the checklist mentality. In the hospitals, in the industry, in the regulators, people are used to work with procedures, they used to follow checklists for things so that they know everything is covered and so on. And as I like to say, our industry is really a big village. We all know each other. And we have people from hospitals going to industry, from industry going to regulators, and so on. So there's constant exchange of stuff between the different parties involved in clinical research, and inevitably that brings the way of thinking of different industries. So if you have someone from the industry going to the regulator, and people who have worked, for example, for big CRO, they might have a specific type of seeing things and expecting things to be done in a specific way. So that's something that we need to work and find a way to allow people more flexible thinking and explore and do things in a different way. So that's a challenge. Another very big challenge, I think, is the reliance on past experience. So it's very hard to change something which you know you've done in the past and it works. Just go and tell people, okay, now I know that worked when you did it in the past, but now you can do it in a different way. It's normal that they'll be reluctant. They'll be like, well, why would I do that differently if I know I can do it the same way and I'll have the same result, most likely. So that's another very big problem that we need to think about. Another important part is that doing things differently is difficult because of widespread views of how things should be done and because of the responsibility. So imagine you have a phase 3 clinical trial, which costs, let's say, $6 million US dollars to do this clinical trial. And you say, well, I'll do it in a different way this time. I'll just design a different way. I'll collect the data in a different way, and so on. And then you end up having questions from the regulator not accepting your data, or for whatever reason not getting the outcome that you expect. The study fails, or something else happen. Then it will be extremely difficult to justify that you've decided to take the risk and do things differently and lose all these money and delay the product getting to the market and all that. Finding excuse and explanation to your investors would be a nightmare. So I would understand why companies will be reluctant to change things if they don't have somehow guarantee that what they're doing will work and what they're doing will actually have the same positive result that they expect when they do it in a traditional way. So that's another, I think, very important thing to think about, the cost involved in clinical research and why people are not willing to take the risk, because it's already risky. If you think about the drug development, it's already risky. So adding even more to that, it might be quite a lot. Another very important challenge are the local country regulations that may not be flexible. So the international GCP guidelines, theoretically they give you more freedom, but in practice, if you have local regulations which restrict you on how you should do things, it's really hard. Take, for example, the European Union. In the UK and in the US, I like to give that example. Remote monitoring is something completely normal because we have a lot of electronic medical records for patients. But countries in the European Union, they use predominantly paper medical records. So for them, remote monitoring will be like not an option. And even the European regulators, they don't accept remote monitoring. In some countries, it's like absolutely no. They think of it as some kind of emergency way of doing monitoring, but they won't be happy if you design your study and you go there and you tell them you want to do remote monitoring. They just won't be happy with your suggestion, and no matter what kind of risk management plan you've done. So these are things that you need to take into consideration. So as I said, you have the flexibility, theoretically, but when you try to implement things in practice, it might turn out that it's not really that flexible anymore. So the next big discussion during the first day was the risk management of clinical trials. So what does it mean, risk management of risk-based quality management? So that means to identify which areas of the clinical trial are critical, like endpoints or targeted monitoring or frequent communications. And based on these, you need to do a dynamic type of risk assessment as your study is going, and see if there are any new critical parameters that you need to consider and include in your risk assessment. Maybe something needs to have additional monitoring, or maybe something needs to be evaluated more closely. So that means you apply risk management to your quality management of the clinical trial. Another important point was the sponsor should have clear oversight of any contractors that are involved in clinical trials. And not just the sponsors, but also the investigators as well. So we need to have that level of transparency on who's doing what. And one of the main focus of the new risk-based quality management system is
to try and identify issues and prevent them before they happen. Now that's a tricky one, I have to say. If we can predict what's going to happen, we can prevent it, that's true. But in many cases, that's not even possible to do. So I think that's more like a wishful thinking. But maybe there are some things that we can prevent, and we can do a proper assessment and try to avoid problems. And I've seen it particularly with the study design of some clinical trials. But when it comes to risk assessment and quality management systems, I think we need to also take into consideration the regulators and their expectations, what kind of data they want to have, and that's something which is outside of the control of the sponsors or the hospitals. So that's down to what kind of clinical evidence you need to provide to have your drug approved on the market. So what is the next topic is what is the concept of risk proportionality? So the clinical trial processes and approaches should be implemented proportionately to the risk to the participants and the criticality of the collected data. And the sponsor should not place unnecessary burden on the participants or researchers. Now that's, again, as I said, it's a very good concept, but in many cases it's challenging to achieve. So it all depends on the clinical evidence that you need to collect to be able to get your drug approved on the market. And as I said, in many cases this is dictated by the regulators or by the price regulator in the case of Europe and other parts of the world. So that's a tricky one. For example, if you need to have the pharmacokinetic samples collected for your study, you have to collect them. If you need to collect them over 24-hour period, you have to do it over 24-hour period. It will be inconvenient for the patients. It will be inconvenient for the hospital staff. But if you have to do it, you have to do it that way because you need to collect this data. So it's really more about being reasonable, what kind of data you need to collect, what is critical for your study, and try to be as reasonable as possible to the patients and the hospitals to make sure that it's not unnecessary burden for them. Another topic that was discussed on that day were the challenges of the real-world data and the decentralized clinical trials. So it was a very interesting case that FDA reviewer discussed, and it was about a clinical trial using real-world evidence data, basically data collected as part of routine care. But they didn't have in the informed consent agreement for the regulator to have access to this data. So when they had an FDA inspection, it took quite some time to arrange for the FDA inspectors to have access to this data because that was not in the initial consent that patients signed. And obviously that delayed the inspection. I'm quite sure it really annoyed FDA. But it's something that we need to think about when we are designing clinical trials with real-world evidence, to make sure that we understand that we use different sources of data, and not all sources are easily accessible for everyone. So we need to make sure that those who are coming to inspect the study will have access to these sources. So that was a very interesting point, and I think we haven't discussed this in the past. Another part when it comes to this type of studies is the researchers' oversight of third-party vendors, and this is particularly important in decentralized clinical trials where you use, let's say, external vendor of nurses that go to patients' homes and collect blood samples, for example. We need to make sure that these nurses, they know what data needs to be collected, and if there is an adverse event, they know how to escalate, they know what is the escalation process. and to make sure you capture all the safety data. Now, the problem with that kind of decentralized clinical trials, because I've worked on such studies in the past, is the data is not always consistent. So sometimes you have one nurse going to see the patient and she reports something, and then you have another nurse going to see that very same patient, she reports something different, and then you need to reconcile and see why you have these discrepancies, because basically that's the same patient on the same treatment, so it doesn't make sense to have contradictory data. But I've seen it myself on working on decentralized clinical trials. So there are plenty of challenges with that type of research. Another big challenge when it comes to decentralized clinical trials is access to systems. You may have many vendors. It could be absolute nightmare for the participants and for the researchers to get access to everything if you're using different vendors. And I've said in the past, I had one clinical trial where we had 10 different vendors, and it was really crazy. So that's something that sponsors need to think about when they design their clinical trial, and make sure that it's really reasonable for everyone and easy to work with. Ideally, if it's only one login and then you have different portals connected within the system, that would be fantastic. But normally, as we know, that's not the case. So if we want to see successful risk management approach, we need to see changes in the mindset of the hospitals, industry, and regulators. But this should also mean more freedom for the industry to manage clinical trials and less guidance documents. The regulators will also need to learn to accept industry risk management plans, and it needs to be a learning curve for everyone if we want this to be successful. I think I understand why the regulators produce all these guidelines, because the industry keeps asking for more and asking more and more specific questions. But my personal view is that regulatory guidelines, they need to be top level. And if you have specific question for specific product and specific development, you need to book a meeting with the regulator, whoever is going to review your data, and go there and discuss with them and ask them the questions, and not expect that the regulators will produce guidelines on every single thing that you do, so that you can just follow the guidelines and don't have to do any thinking outside of it. So it's really, we need to find a better dynamic and to start thinking more critically, to be a bit more independent on how we do things. And at the same time, if we keep the transparency and we discuss with the regulators what we do, and they give us advice, it will work. And I think it will be a lot less expensive to conduct clinical trials, and it will be a lot more practical and easy to do. So I'm really hoping that we will use this opportunity for the risk-based approach, and we'll try to do things in a simpler way, more efficient, and have quicker results. Because at the end of the day, we all want to have the data, and we all want the treatment to work for the patients, and we all want patients to have access to new treatments. So that's the final goal. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was interesting.